Good morning, everybody. Good to have you with us today. We're here with Dr. Carl Savage, who a co-author with Bill Presnell of one of our textbooks for this course, A Seminal Introduction to Narrative Research in Ministry, a postmodern, let's see what it says here, postmodern research approach for faith communities. Today, we'll focus on a section that has been the bane of narrative researchers in the process of evaluation for the project work. Good morning, Dr. Carl. Nice to have you with us.
Hi, Dan. Good to be with you.
Good. Let's just start off off the bat. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book?
So there was back in the 80s, that long ago, there was a book called Research in Ministry. And now the name of the person who wrote it escapes me. But anyway, that was the basic research book that doctor ministry programs use, but it was very clinically based. In other words, your congregation was your test subject for doing something to them. And that to me was a little inimical about what actually being in ministry is and being in a collaborative setting with other people of faith. And the whole idea of this new approach is the minister researcher is not the expert, but the term we use in the book is the storyboker, or the one that is kind of the collaborative leader with the group, rather than the expert who comes in with a solution. So that's where it came from.
Okay, it's a slim volume, so it's very approachable. Let's go on to right into the meat of the matter. On page 124 of your book, you describe the twin prongs of the purpose for a ministry project with regard to evaluation: observing change and discerning transformation. Can you say a little bit more about why these are important at the outset and at the end of research as a gateway to the evaluation process?
So in the past, the older models, you measure the change, which is what the change is. There's things you can measure. Attendance went up, giving went up, participation increased in a certain Bible study or whatever. So those are kinds of things that you can measure, but it doesn't tell you about internal changes or what we call transformation. And the transformation is really the heart of what you're trying to get at in a ministry project. If you do anything, things will change. Okay, so every DMin project or every ministry degree project will cause change in the setting, in the congregational or faith community setting that you're working with. The question is, are the people really transformed by whatever it is you're implementing? So that's where that comes from, the idea that it's two separate things. You know, don't think that because attendance is up, necessarily people have become deeper in their faith commitment. To be a little trivial with that kind of distinction.
So is it fair to say that one should have a concept of what they expect out of the project at the outset, or would you consider that to be front loading? And could you talk a little bit about how to avoid that problem?
So you could wind up discovering what you thought you would find. And in archaeology, the same thing. You always find what you're looking for, or almost always. So, but you do have to approach it with some concept of what your newly intended future is, the kind of phrase that we use, is going to be. This is what we would like to happen. Okay, and you have that kind of sense. Otherwise, you're just let's do something, and something is better than nothing. You know, and that's not really what a ministry project's about. So you do have a sense of what you expect to happen, but in the evaluation process, you're not looking for just that. You want to get a concept of what happened in the context in totality, because there may be a lot or a few unintended consequences, things that happen that you didn't expect, that are surprising or disappointing, depending on what they are.
Pretty interesting. In my own research, that was the case. The surprises were abounding. And you go on to list what I might call the big five evaluation windows that appear in your book on page 128 to 129. Can we consider each one in turn? You call the first one functionalist and describe how a project might affect how parts of a context might fit together differently after a project. Perhaps you could give us an example from a past project that you might want to talk about.
So there actually is one in the book that's mentioned, the graveyard project, relocating the graveyard. And when Bill and I, the project never really happened. So we kind of projected what might have happened and then talked about how we might evaluate it. So one of the things is this idea of the functionalist, or how do the parts fit together post-project that may be different. And it could be anything. You could have a dominating, say, church board that's dominated by a few people. How does it look after the project? You know, in one of my ministry settings, it was a church that had merged way back when, you know, in other words, in the 30s.
Oh, wow.
So I was there in the 70s. So 40 years, so almost a generation, or practically a generation. But there were still dividing lines within the congregation. The merged church was much smaller, and so they had taken over a Bible class, you know, kind of thing. And so part of my experience there was negotiating these kind of boundaries and trying to get them to fit together differently rather than to being so oppositional. So that's one way to look at it. But in the book, and this is on page 135, where I'm looking at the functionalist evaluation. I may have to put glasses on to be able to read this, but I'll try without first. She in her development, and she actually did the development of the project, made the topic outline and so forth. She gathered a bunch of stories, and in moving the graveyard, which was what this was about, or anticipating relocating the graveyard and the church, both. She had stories of the relatives of the dead who were buried in the graveyard. You know, there's grandma, and I sit in a pew and I could look out the window at her grave every Sunday, sort of thing. The town officials that wanted the church to move because they wanted to develop the land in a different way than having a church at a major crossroads in the highway, townspeople, and so forth, and how all these stories were somewhat oppositional in the beginning, and you would look to see, well, how do they fit together afterwards?
Okay.
So how do parts of the system, parts of the faith community, however you divide it, or however you observed it being divided, how do they fit together after the project?
It's interesting. I think the next one's called ecological, and I find that interesting for those contexts that might start out isolated from their surrounding environment and now maybe more engaged. Could you say more about that?
So that's exactly what we're talking about, is the context that the faith community finds itself in. And no, normally ecological is, you're talking about the physical landscape. So
Right.
There is some of that. You could be in an urban setting, or you could be in the case of this relocating church. They were a country church, and then the country roads turned into 4-lane highways, and so they're no longer a country church. So that was one of the things that happened physically to them. But there are other ecologies that a faith community is embedded in. It could be the denomination that they're in. It could be the other churches in the town that are competing entities in some sense. So all those things make up the kind of ecology that you find it in. And what ecology looks about is how you might be more engaged with these other things that are surrounding the church. So it's kind of looking outside of the faith community for things in the larger setting that influence what's going on in the inside.
Which brings up the next one, which of course is called materialist, and it seems to me that it's kind of the reverse of ecological in that it looks at how the environment might have affected the context. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, it's a. Let me look to see how I actually defined it before
Okay.
The part of the problem is sometimes you change your own understanding of these things.
Right.
You have to realize these were just thought of lenses to
Mm-hmm.
observe a context, more than one facet of it. So they're not written in stone, and they're not the only ways to look at it. They're just tools to kind of observe things through different lenses about what has happened. And let me see now. Got to go back.
Yeah, I'm looking through it myself here.
So, oh, I should have highlighted the whole before we even talked about these 5 different things. Is you're actually evaluating more than one thing when you evaluate a ministry project.
Okay.
There are actually 3 kinds of constituents in the evaluation. There's the context, which we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We've been
Yes.
using these lenses to talk about the context. But there's also could be the team, the ministry team that works with the leader to enable whatever the project is. And then
Okay.
there's the researcher, the student themselves, who could be affected by the project and their understanding of ministry and their experience of ministry. So there's those 3 constituents that are also involved in the larger context. So then these lenses that we've been talking about, functional, ecological, and we're going to talk about materialistic in a second, are ways of thickening the observed changes to understand if there's transformation. That's kind of where we're going with this.
Mm-hmm.
So you can measure changes, but then you want to understand by using these other lenses, is there something larger going on, a deeper process?
Right. Right.
Okay, so now, materialistic. And you're right, it's connected to the ecological in some sense, but it looks how the context is affected by changes in the surroundings that are beyond their control. So
Okay.
it's easy to think of one right now. It's called COVID-19.
Ah, very good.
Okay, so that's affected every context of ministry. And back when the book was being written, it was 9/11
Mm-hmm.
that affected every ministry project at that time. And so those are big picture things, but it could be more localized things beyond control that happen. So the responding to social change, the Black Lives Matter movement could be another one that deeply affects beyond the control of a local situation. And so they impinge on the project implementation in ways that you need to discern, and
Mm-hmm.
think about how that has impacted well beyond what you intended by your own actions. Um, so materialistic is looking at responses to social changes beyond the control of the local context, local faith community.
Mm-hmm. A shameless plug there, as you mentioned COVID-19. Students can check out my a class that I posted on how to do a faith and film series during a pandemic. So, shameless tool commercial finished.
There you go. There you
There we go. So in the 4th evaluation tool, it's called structuralist. You comment that a project might engender unintended consequences
Right.
as the new project realizations replace old constructs. We've already talked about a lot of that, so we can see how some of these lenses, as you describe them, overlap. So
Right.
any structuralist examples that can come to mind?
So every list is not a real thing. You know, in other words, so I made a list of 5, but
Right.
as you say, they all overlap. So structuralist may be where you see more of the resistance patterns develop. So that as you change the way you intend to change the way things are related within your context, you may find the resistance coming to fore. It's probably well, it's not probably. It always was there,
Yes.
but because you've challenged things, it comes more to the fore. So when you bring a new pattern in, say you want to change worship from 11 o'clock to 10 o'clock,
Mhm.
you're going to find all kinds of resistances to that. And no matter how well intended you are, you're going to change old patterns. And the structuralist looks about how new patterns emerge. And,
Mhm.
and it could be barriers or emergence of the new story that you want to emerge, the
Mhm.
preferred or newly intended future. Used to say preferred future, but that means you got to decide
Mhm.
what was preferred or not. So you intend to do something, whether it's good or not, remains to be seen in your evaluation. So,
As in, I meant to do that kind of thing?
yeah, yeah.
I see. Okay.
I mean, ultimately, you want God's story to come to the fore, and
Right.
for you to presume that you know fully what that story is a little presumptuous. So
Right.
you're intending to be a bigger part of God's story through your ministry action.
That's a good
So
intention.
yeah, so the structuralist looks at the post-project structures as opposed to the pre-project structures, and
Mhm.
and it may have been that you intentionally changed some of the things. You know,
Mhm.
like for example, in the Methodist system, there used to be an administrative board and a council of ministry,
Mhm.
and
Okay.
you could combine those two things. It makes a new structure. What were the results of that? What were the resistances? What were the positive things? What were the so that's kind of you can measure the change, but then you can look to see how what emerged as is it transformative or not.
And so the last approach that you mentioned is called semiotic, which of course relies on symbolism that might arise from the project, combining experiences from the inside of the project with those arising from the outside. Say more about how this could work.
So an example that comes to mind almost immediately is I remember coming to churches and they would print how much the offering was and how much the budget was and what the shortfall was. Okay,
Okay.
that was the typical pattern. It didn't take into account seasonal patterns of giving.
Mhm.
You know, like everyone knows Easter time, everybody comes and they give. You know, Christmas time, everybody's thinking about giving. And so in the churches that I experienced, Easter and Christmas were much higher giving patterns
Right.
than the middle of summer when your offerings are very low, everybody's on vacation. And so you're telling a story by printing it that way and saying deficit.
Mhm.
Okay. So if you change the way that's presented, which is a semiotic thing, you're
Mhm.
retelling the story of the budget in a different way, you change perceptions about how are things going in the church. You know, it's that sort of thing. What are the coded languages, and if you look at bigger things, that people are using to talk about how things are going? What descriptions are they using, uh, and what stories are they telling in general, you know, about this. So, for example, you can come into a context and get a lot of the golden years stories. You know, back when I was, things were
Right.
better.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
whatever it is, and what you find out, in some sense, is there never was the golden era
Right.
per se, but there's a conception or perception that things were better because there's an underlying reason why they thought things were better. For example, it could be that the minister who was there at the time was their age. You know,
Right.
in other
Mhm.
words, they were fully involved uh, and so forth. And now, and I can remember the chairman of the board handing me the keys to a parsonage, and I could tell something was bothering her. And she goes, I hope, long pause, you kids will be happy here. Because I was like 24, 25, and she was in her 50s, you know, so
Yes,
I was
right.
not a part of her conception of what a pastor should be
Right.
at the time. So it's those kinds of things, those languages, descriptions of the context that are developed from inside, or it could be outside. Suddenly in the town, they're saying, hey, things are happening at XYZ church, you know, they are whatever. So the story has changed around them. So semiotics is talking about those kinds of things, the things that express meaning for the context. And it's borrowing from Len Sweet's semiotics, his term.
Right. That's excellent. Carl, that's great. Thanks very much for being with us today to talk about evaluation. You have any closing remarks that you'd like to share?
Just that for a ministry project, you need to do both things. You need to measure the change, because sometimes you can find out that the facts, in quotations, are different than the story being told.
Right.
So I remember one DMin project, in his write-up, the student was saying his middle-class church, you know, the whole time. And when you look at the economic data, the average salary was $90-some thousand. Okay.
Yeah.
And I said, are you really middle class? But that was the story they were telling. So that you had a disconnect between what you could measure and what was being told. And so part of these lenses are to look at those kinds of things in totality, so that you can really discern transformation and hopefully get to that newly intended future that your project is addressing.
Very good. Remember, everybody, the book is Narrative Research in Ministry. It's one of your required books. And if you have any further questions, be sure to contact your faculty members, and we'll help you through it. Thanks very much. Have a great day.